I still remember that night. The sky above Santa Clara was deep blue velvet, the kind that dims quietly into the earth without ever announcing the end of day. It was late, though I did not look at a clock. The silence of the garden told me everything. The trees stood motionless. The grass barely stirred. Even the air seemed to hold its breath, as if it, too, was waiting for me to make a decision I would regret forever. Buck didn't bark. He never did with me. He came trotting toward me, his paws silent on the damp stone path, his large body regal and strong, his eyes full of the blind trust that only an innocent can afford. I had tied the rope around my wrist long before he arrived, hidden in the folds of my sleeve, and my hand trembled as I reached down to stroke his neck. He wagged his tail, brushing it gently against my leg. I remember thinking how soft his fur was, brushed that very morning by Judge Miller's youngest daughter, who had spent nearly an hour singing to him while she worked. And yet I pulled the rope tight. There was no struggle, no cry, just a brief hesitation as Buck turned his head to look at Menot with anger, not even fear, but confusion. Why? If he could speak, perhaps that's what he would have asked. Why, Manuel? I had no answer. Only the quiet weight of guilt and the memory of the Chinese lottery that had swallowed my wages, my savings, my dignity. I owed more than I could repay, and Buck so strong, so handsome, so prized, was worth more than I could ever earn under the sun. I did it with full awareness, and yet I told myself it was a kind of accident. The mind has ways of painting betrayal in softer colours. We slipped out through the back gate. The man who waited in the shadows was thick-bodied and silent, his eyes quick and dismissive. He did not look at Buck, only at the envelope of cash I would soon place in his hand. Buck growled softly, sensing something I refused to admit even to myself. And then we walked. Down the alley, past the closed bakery and the grocer's lamp, past the garden walls of homes filled with sleeping children and loyal pets. Buck followed, trustingly, blindly. I remember that the moon hung low that night, and as I passed under its light, I realized for the first time how cold my hands were. The man took Buck roughly when we reached the rail yard. The train cars stood like metal giants in the dark, sighing out steam and creaking under invisible weight. Buck resisted for the first time, then pulling back, barking, his front paws scraping across the gravel as they dragged him toward the boxcar. I did not stay to watch. Cowardice, perhaps, or shame. But I turned away, and I ran back down the street, through the alley, past the garden, through the gate I had opened not an hour before. The house stood as it always had, grand, quiet, asleep. The only thing different was the absence of footsteps in the garden, the absence of Buck. I stood by the back door, hand still gripping the empty rope, and wondered if they would notice by morning. Of course they would. The judge, the children, the maids, even the stable hands. Buck was not a dog that could disappear without a sound. I thought of the judge's voice that morning, praising Buck for his fine coat, his noble stance. I thought of the boy laughing as Buck carried him across the lawn like a proud steed. I thought of myself, just a gardener with dirty hands, stealing something far greater than a dog. I had not just sold Buck, I had sold their joy. And for what? A few crumpled bills in the dark. They say every action has a consequence, but rarely do we know when that consequence begins. For Buck, it began with the sound of my boots on the gravel. For me, it began with the silence that followed. But we all have our nights, don't we? Nights where a single choice opens a door we cannot close again. I have replayed that night in my mind countless times, each time hoping to rewrite it. But it always ends the same, with Buck disappearing into the dark, and me standing in the garden, pretending I did not just sever a bond that was never mine to break. Still, I wonder, if I had paused one more second, would he still be here? Sometimes, in life, we make decisions under the weight of fear, of desperation, of pride. And only much later, when the dust has long settled, do we realize that what we lost was far more than what we gained. But such is the nature of regret. It whispers, it lingers, and it never forgets. The coins were gone within a week. Gambling is like that, easy to lose, harder to explain. I had nothing to show for what I'd done. Not even the illusion of gain, only the memory of Buck's eyes and the rope that I could no longer bring myself to touch. But this story is not about me. It is about him. About the dog that walked into the dark because of my mistake and stepped into a world that would challenge every bone, every breath, every quiet part of his soul. They called it the Northland. I had never been there and never would. But in the weeks after I sold Buck, I began to hear rumors, whispers passed along by men who had seen things beyond the snow, in lands where dogs were not pets, but lifelines. It was gold, they said. Gold had been discovered in the Yukon, and men flooded into the wilderness like ants chasing sugar. There were no roads, no trains, no carriages, only ice, silence, and the desperate hope of becoming rich. And so dogs were needed, strong dogs, sled dogs, dogs like Buck. I imagine his journey now, not because I know it, but because I owe it to him to picture it as clearly as I can. The boxcar that swallowed him must have smelled like oil and rot. Iron wheels grinding over rails, men cursing in languages Buck didn't understand. Food thrown on the floor, cold metal beneath his paws, and above it all, confusion. The kind that settles into the heart when you know something is wrong, but you don't know what, or why, or who to blame. He was chained, of course. That much I heard later, and muzzled, and beaten. It is said that Buck met the man in the red sweater next. I never knew his name, no one seems to. But every dog that passed through that man's hands learned one lesson before they left. The law of club. It was not training, it was domination. Buck, proud and strong, had likely resisted at first. His bloodline was regal, part saint. Bernard, part Scotch shepherd bred, not to obey, but to command. But clubs are persuasive. Pain teaches quickly what pride will not. And so Buck learned. He learned to crouch, to submit, to wait. But I believe something else stirred in him during those days. Not just fear, but awareness of his strength, of his instincts, of the deep memory buried beneath generations of domestication. I think Buck began to remember, not memories like ours of birthdays, or names, or regrets, but older memories, ones not born in thought, but in muscle and bone and blood, of running through trees, of biting and being bitten, of fighting for a scrap of meat beneath a pale moon. They say Buck's eyes changed during that time. The man in the red sweater, he wasn't cruel for sport. He was practical. Every blow had purpose, every punishment a boundary. But Bucky didn't break. He bent, yes, but he remembered. He remembered everything. And when he finally stopped resisting, it wasn't because he had forgotten who he was. It was because he was learning who he could become. And then came the sale. Again. Men with hard voices and frozen beards, a team of sled dogs, a trail to be followed, a harness to be worn, and Buck, now leaner, quieter, his eyes scanning everything not with fear, but calculation. He was changing, already. But I think of that moment when the chain came off his neck and the harness slipped over his chest. When the sled began to move and Buck, for the first time in his life, pulled not out of play or pride, but necessity. He must have felt it. The shift. From house to trail. From pet to beast. We all have those moments, don't we? Moments when something inside us goes silent and something older wakes up. When the path ahead is not chosen, but demanded. And we step forward, not because we want to, but because there is no other way. I wonder if Buck missed the garden, the warm kitchen, the soft bed. Or perhaps he was beginning to forget. That's what time does after all. It doesn't just heal, it reshapes, rewrites, replaces. And the further Buck moved north, the further he moved from the dog I had known. Still, I wonder, if I had gone after him that day, what would I have found? A dog? Or something already wild again? We never know how far we are from ourselves until we are forced to survive.
The first snowfall came early that year. At least, that's what I heard from the men who'd returned from the Yukon half-starved, frostbitten but glitter-eyed, with stories of gold and dogs and death. They spoke of the trail as if it were a beast, living and cruel, swallowing men whole and leaving only bones behind. But they also spoke of the dogs. That Buck, one man said over whiskey in the back room of the saloon, he's not like the others. I sat silently, pretending not to listen, though every word carved into me like a blade. They said he was clever, powerful, commanding. He had learned the trail faster than any dog they'd seen. He didn't just follow orders, he understood them. He was beginning to lead, and yet it wasn't leadership born of obedience, but of something deeper, something raw. Buck had joined a team led by two French-Canadian couriers, Francois and Perrault. Government dispatchmen trusted to carry mail through impossible distances. They had an eye for dogs, and Buck had been the prize of their pack. The other dog, Spitz, Dave, Sol-Lex were no gentle companions. There was no room for softness in the traces, only strength and submission. Buck had to learn quickly. And he did. But not by mimicry, by instinct. They said he slept in the snow, carving out hollows with his body like the other sled dogs, that the cold no longer startled him, that hunger was now a familiar ache, that his muscles thickened and his coat grew dense like a wolf's. I imagined him there beneath a canopy of stars, the northern lights waltzing overhead, while a fire crackled far away where men huddled in parkas, and Buck curled tightly, nose to tail, his breath forming clouds in the sub-zero air. He was surviving, but more than that, he was awakening. The man in the saloon told of a moment small but unforgettable, a supply camp along the trail, night falling fast. Buck stood apart from the others, eyes fixed on a distant hill. A coyote had howled, not close, but close enough, and Buck had lifted his head, slowly, ears raised not in fear, not in curiosity, but in recognition, as if the sound was not foreign, but familiar, ancient, like a name whispered in a dream you no longer remember, but somehow still know. It chills me to think of it. That even then, so early in his journey, Buck was already hearing it.
The call, not from a man, not from memory, but from something buried beneath every heartbeat, every breath, a song written into his blood before he ever wore a collar. And yet, he still pulled, still obeyed. For now. I wonder if there was a war inside him, a tearing between what he had known and what he was remembering. Between the porch steps of Santa Clara and the silent ice of the Yukon. Between the pet and the predator. But maybe we are all like that. Torn between two worlds. One that shaped us. One that waits for us. They said Buck challenged Spitz not long after, the lead dog, a tyrant of the traces, ruthless, efficient, feared. Buck, they said, began undermining him not with violence at first, but with quiet defiance, taking his food, stealing his place, blocking his path. It was not rebellion, it was emergence. I did not witness it, of course, but in my mind I see the scene. Snow falling like ash, breath misting in the moonlight, and two shapes circling each other, one fighting to keep power, the other born to claim it. Spitz had the experience, Buck had the fire, and in the end, fire consumed Frost. They say it was brutal, that the others watched in silence, neither helping nor fleeing, that the law of the wild is simple, dominance is destiny, and that when it was over, Buck did not celebrate. He simply took his place at the front. No ceremony, no crown, just purpose. The traces moved forward, and Buck with them, now not just as one among many, but as the one who led them all. And I back in the warmth of a town that no longer felt like home, I sat with my silence. I imagined his paws cracking over ice, his breath steady, his mind clearer than ever. He was no longer the dog I had known. But something told me he wasn't finished changing. Still, I wonder, do we become who we are, or who the world forces us to be? In Buck's rise, I saw not just a dog's transformation, but a truth I had long avoided, that sometimes hardship does not break us. It reveals us. A dog cannot rule without proving himself again and again, so I heard from those who had seen Buck lead. He was no tyrant like Spitz had been, nor was he soft. His dominance was earned, not forced. He demanded excellence not with cruelty, but with presence. His team obeyed him not just because he was strong, but because he was sure. And yet, leadership on the trail is never safe. The wild tests it daily. The land gave no mercy. Blizzards that blinded, rivers that cracked beneath the sleds, food that grew scarcer with each mile. But Buck endured. He learned not just the rhythms of the trail, but of the men who drove him. He could read the tension in Perrault's shoulders, the caution in Francois's voice. He responded before commands were even given, and more than once he saved their lives. There was one crossing the frozen 30-mile river, treacherous, fragile, moaning beneath their weight. The ice could break at any moment. The men hesitated. The other dogs trembled. But Buck stepped forward. One paw, then another. He did not rush. He did not pause. And when he reached the far bank, he turned not to wait, but to pull. That night, the firelight flickered against the canvas tent, and Francois, they say, whispered to Perrault, "He's more than dog now. He's spirit." And still, Buck had not yet fully answered the call within him, but he was closer. I tried not to think of him during those weeks. I threw myself into the garden, planting, trimming, shoveling, but everything I touched seemed smaller now, meaningless. What were roses to a creature that had run beneath the northern lights? I began dreaming of him, not as he had been, but as he might be, chest deep in snow, eyes lit by moonlight, wind in his fur. Sometimes he looked at me in the dream, but he never came closer, as if to say, "I am not yours anymore." And he wasn't. He belonged to the wild now. To the sound of sled runners on packed snow, the crunch of frozen meat between teeth, the pulse of instinct beneath ice. But fate, as always, is impatient. Perrault and Francois were reassigned. New orders. The government had no room for sentiment. Buck and the team were sold again, to men who knew nothing of dogs. Hal, Charles, Mercedes. Even their names sounded brittle. No respect for the land, no understanding of what it required. They carried mirrors and canned peaches and folding chairs, things that held no meaning where survival was the only language spoken. They overpacked the sled, They overworked the dogs. They underestimated the trail. And Buck, though strong, could not carry ignorance forever. I was told the dogs stumbled, grew thin, collapsed, that the woman wept, the men argued, and the sled broke more than it moved. But Bucky did not break. Even as the traces grew cruel, as food disappeared, as whips cracked with frustration instead of rhythm, Buck endured. Not because he was loyal to them, but because he was loyal to life itself. They beat him, yes, and still he stood, until the day he didn't. It was an old man camped beside the river, John Thornton. He saw what they were doing and stepped between Buck and the whip. Hal raised his hand again, but John warned him. Another blow, and there'd be 2 bodies in the snow. They laughed. But something in Thornton's eyes must have made them stop. That night, the campfire burned low, and Buck lay unmoving in the snow. Not because he could not move, but because he chose not to, as if he too had drawn a line. And when Hal and his companions left the next morning, dragging the sled toward a trail that no longer held, Buck did not follow. A mile downriver, the ice gave way. The sled was swallowed whole. I wonder if Buck watched from the bank, eyes calm, heart steady, knowing he had once again escaped death by the breadth of a breath. Or perhaps he didn't look at all. Perhaps he had already turned to the man who had stood for him. Still, I wonder, when do we stop being what others demand and become what we truly are? It was not just survival that had shaped Buck, it was choice. And in choosing to stay with John Thornton, Buck took his first step not towards civilization, but towards something deeper. Bond. Not of chain, but of trust. I never met John Thornton, but I've imagined him more vividly than most people I've known. The men who came down from the north, those few who survived with their minds intact, spoke of him with a quiet kind of reverence. A loner, a prospector, a man who had been broken once deeply, and chose to live not among men, but among rivers and trees. Perhaps that's why Buck trusted him. For the first time since I tied that rope around Buck's neck, he found a human being who didn't command, or punish, or exploit, but simply was. John didn't try to own Buck. He didn't bend him to his will. He just opened his hands, and Buck came. That kind of bond, I think, is rare. They say Buck guarded him like no other, sleeping near him at night, growling low if strangers approached too quickly. But it wasn't possession. It was loyalty. A fierce, quiet loyalty that came not from obedience, but from recognition. John didn't treat Buck like a dog. He treated him like something more. And Buck responded in kind. He followed John from camp to camp, trail to trail, but always on his own terms. He obeyed not because he feared punishment, but because he wanted to, because he chose to. And choice, after all Buck had endured, was sacred. They traveled together into deep country past the Klondike, beyond the stampedes of gold seekers, into untouched wilderness where rivers ran like veins across the earth and stars spilled without end. It was there that Buck truly began to change. The men in the saloon didn't understand it. "He acts like he's half wolf," one said, shaking his head. "Goes off for days into the woods, comes back silent, eyes wild," but I understood. He was remembering again. There were dreams, they said, Buck howling in his sleep, legs twitching as if running across some ancient plain. There were tracks in the forest beside the camp, wolves, sometimes close, sometimes distant. And Buck would vanish into the trees, gone for hours, days even, only to return and lay his head gently on Thornton's knee as if to say, I'm still yours for now. John didn't tie him up, didn't scold him for leaving. He simply waited. It takes a rare soul to love something wild without trying to tame it. I often wonder what Buck saw in those woods, what voices he heard, what instincts rose like smoke from the deep parts of his blood. Perhaps he hunted. Perhaps he ran until his legs shook. Perhaps he stood on a cliff and howled not in sorrow, but in calling. And still he returned. That, to me, is the greatest mystery, that something so free could still choose to come back. There was one story I heard, half legend perhaps, but true enough for those who lived it. A man challenged Thornton in a bar, mocking his trust in the dog. "How much do you think he'd do for you?" the man sneered. John didn't answer. He simply turned to Buck and spoke a single word: "Jump." And Buck leapt, off the edge of the cliff, into the roaring river below. The current pulled him under. The ice tore at his body. He nearly drowned. But he made it to shore, bruised, bloodied, gasping, and returned to John's feet. Not because he was told, but because he believed. What kind of heart does that? What kind of soul leaps for love, not command? Buck, they said, would have died for John. But perhaps what matters more is that he lived for him. And yet, even in the deepest moments of devotion, the call never stopped. It came in wind, in night, in silence. It came from the earth beneath his paws and the sky above the trees. Still, I wonder, can one belong to two worlds at once? Can we give our hearts to love and still hear the wild singing inside us? Buck did not choose between them yet, but the choice was coming. The wild waits for no one. There is a silence in the deep forest that cannot be described, only felt. I imagine Buck walking through that stillness, his steps muffled by pine needles, his breath visible in the morning frost. No harness, no leash, no voice calling him back. Just the trees, the sky, and the scent of the wild wrapped around him like a forgotten memory. This was where he went, again and again, during those months with John Thornton. Each time a little farther, each time a little longer. They said he would disappear for days, and when he returned, there was always something different in his eyes, a flicker, a distance, as though some part of him had stayed behind in the woods. But he always came back, not just out of habit but with purpose. He would return to the firelight, the familiar smell of camp, and the sound of John's voice, low, steady, human. Even the wolves, I heard, had begun to take notice. A lean grey timber wolf appeared one evening across the river. Buck did not bark. He simply stood there, staring at the creature that mirrored him, feral, silent, watching. Neither approached, neither fled. And then the wolf vanished into the trees. But he returned. Again and again. They began to move together, I'm told. Cautiously at first, like strangers circling the same fire, then more closely, and Bucky began to run with the wolf. Not always, not forever, but enough. Enough to remember what it felt like to belong not to a man, but to the land. Still, he came back. He always came back. Why? I ask myself that more than anything else. After all the pain I caused him, after all the suffering he endured because of men like me, why did Buck still choose love? John had saved him, yes, but Buck had known kindness before. He had known comfort, family, loyalty, and we had betrayed him. I had betrayed him, and yet he chose to trust again. There's something holy in that, isn't there? To trust again, not because you forget, but because you choose to believe in something better. But something had changed in Buck beyond the eyes and muscles and instincts. He no longer feared the wild. He no longer hesitated at its edges. It welcomed him now. He moved through it like a ghost returning home. He hunted. He tracked. He howled. That's what they said, that his voice had returned. Not barking, not whining, howling. At first, soft, then louder, deeper, longer. A voice from the marrow. A voice that didn't come from training or memory, but from the very origins of life itself. And the wolves answered, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always answering. At night, Buck would lie beside the fire, eyes half closed, ears twitching toward the tree line. Thornton would look at him, perhaps even call to him, and Buck would raise his head, nuzzle his hand, and stay. But I think both of them knew. The time was coming. The bond between them was strong. But the bond between Buck and the wild, it was ancient. There was one tale foolish, maybe, but I believe it. A moose, huge, aggressive, a beast of the north, feared by all. Buck hunted it for days, alone. Patient, merciless, precise. Not for food, not for sport, but for something else. Dominance, mastery. He didn't just survive the wilderness, he conquered it. And when he finally brought the moose down, after days of stalking, testing, wearing it down, it wasn't triumph on his face, they said. It was silence, acceptance, as though something in him had clicked into place. I think Buck had begun to understand that he was not what men had made him, not what collars or commands had shaped. He was something older, something deeper. Still, he returned to Thornton, perhaps to say goodbye, perhaps because in some part of him love still burned brighter than instinct. But I wonder, when does longing become destiny? When does the call become too loud to ignore? Buck stood at the edge of two worlds, and soon he would have to choose. Choice is a quiet thing. It does not shout, it does not demand. It waits, watching, listening, until the moment comes when we no longer ask, should I? But simply, now. I believe that moment had begun to arrive for Buck. He had tested the edge of wildness. He had run with it, breathed it, tasted its silence. But he had also returned again and again to the firelight of John Thornton's camp, to warmth, to voice, to hands that did not strike. But something was changing in Buck. Not abruptly, not violently, but steadily, like ice melting under sunlight. John had led the small party himself, Buck and two other men deeper than before, in search of a lost mine rumoured to lie beyond the last traces of the Yukon Trail. Gold, untouched, hidden for centuries. They found it, or something close to it. A deep valley, far removed from every map, where gold flakes lined the stream beds and nuggets could be plucked from under the moss. A paradise of promise. Riches, yes, but also peace. No voices, no footsteps, only wind and water and the sound of trees breathing. There, Buck ran free, more than ever before. Thornton trusted him completely. There were no leashes, no orders, no fences. Buck came and went as he pleased. And in that freedom, his transformation accelerated. He grew leaner, sharper, more fluid in movement. His eyes turned from amber to flame. His coat, though still thick with the memory of domesticity, took on the sheen of a creature reborn. They said he began hunting wolves not for bloodlust, but for dominance. Not killing them always, but driving them off, asserting something that pulsed in his marrow. He was testing himself against the forest. He was asking the world, "Am I worthy?" And the world answered. They spoke of a black bear, old, blind in one eye, scarred with years. Buck did not attack it. He followed it, studied it, moved around it like a shadow. He did not need to conquer it. He only needed to understand it. This was no longer the Buck I had betrayed. This was something else. Entirely. Sometimes I wonder what John saw when Buck returned from the woods. Did he still see the dog he had pulled from the brink of death? Or did he too sense the widening gap between them? There was still love, deep, loyal, unshaken. Buck would lay his head on John's knee and close his eyes, sighing like a creature momentarily at peace. But his ears never stopped listening. His muscles never fully relaxed. He was no longer resting. He was waiting. One day, he didn't return by dusk, then not by dawn. Days passed. John must have worried. Of course he did. But he did not chase him. He knew, and perhaps, in his quiet heart, he had always known. Buck returned on the fourth morning silent, dirty, wild-eyed. And yet, there was blood on his fur, not his own. He did not explain. He couldn't. But John welcomed him without question, as always. No anger, no leash, just a hand on the shoulder. And Bucky leaned into it, just for a moment, before pulling away and walking to the edge of the camp to sleep alone. I think he was trying to live in both worlds, but no creature can do that forever. Still, I wonder, when we find who we really are, can we still go back to who we were? Buck had followed the arc of instinct to its limit. But instinct does not bargain. It does not pause. It only calls. And soon Buck would answer, not with hesitation, not with sorrow, but with inevitability. The forest had claimed him long before it ever took him. That's what I believe now. Even when Buck lay beside Thornton's fire, even when he guarded the camp like a soldier, even when he drank from the same cup and listened to the same voice he loved, something inside him had already crossed over. Perhaps John knew it too. But what is love if not letting something go, even when every part of you wants it to stay? They remained in that valley for weeks, maybe months. The gold was abundant. Thornton and his companions dug, sifted, stored. They had no need to rush. The place was isolated, safe, timeless. But for Buck, time was not still. It was ticking, not forward but inward. Each day he ventured farther into the woods, not just to run or hunt or roam, but to disappear, to unmake the domesticated self, piece by piece, until all that remained was breath, muscle, and memory. They say he began to run with the wolves, not just beside them, but among them. He was accepted, one of the pack. At night, he would still return. Covered in leaves and mud, his eyes glowing with moonlight, he no longer brought kills back to camp. He no longer curled beside the fire. He would stand on the edge, watching, before lying down alone under the open sky. The wild was no longer calling. It was pulling. And yet, he stayed. For John. Even as the wolves howled for him, even as the trees opened their arms to welcome him back to the ancient rhythm, he remained. Because of that one voice, that one hand, that one man who had done what I could not, loved without control. There was a quiet morning they spoke of, mist on the water, Buck standing at the edge of the river, eyes fixed on the trees. The grey wolf appeared, no growling, no barking, just a long shared gaze. And then the wolf turned. Buck did not follow, not yet. I can picture him returning to camp, walking slowly, John looking up from a pile of gold dust, his face lighting up not with relief, but with understanding. Perhaps they didn't speak. Perhaps they didn't need to. Love, at its deepest, is silent. But fate is never quiet for long. One morning, Buck left again. A hunt, perhaps. A run. No one knew. He was gone for 2 days. The forest, it seemed, had fully taken him now. When he returned, the sun was rising. Smoke filled the air. Not from a fire, not from a meal, from ruin. The camp was gone. Tents collapsed, gold scattered, bodies lifeless and still. The river ran red where it had once been clear. John Thornton was dead. Killed by Yeehat raiders, native warriors, desperate and ruthless, who had stumbled upon the hidden wealth. They had taken everything, except Buck. Because Buck had taken them. They say what followed was not a battle, it was vengeance. Buck hunted them down, one by one, silent, swift, brutal. Not like a dog, not even like a wolf, like something older, like the forest itself, enraged. The survivors fled, whispering of a ghost beast that struck from shadows. They never returned. Thornton was buried beneath a pine tree. And Buck? He did not howl, he simply stood, still, and then he walked into the forest, and did not come back. Still, I wonder, what do we become when love is lost and only truth remains? Buck's truth was never leash or gold or man. It was the wild. And now, with nothing left to hold him back, he stepped into it. Not broken, not afraid, but whole. The forest didn't just accept him, it claimed him. There was no ceremony, no howl to mark the crossing, just silence. A silence deeper than any cage he had ever known. Buck did not run into it as an outsider. He returned to it like a forgotten son stepping back into the place he had been born. He was no longer the dog from Santa Clara, not the sled leader, not even the companion of John Thornton. He had become something else entirely. They say the wolves followed him, not as a leader at first, but as a curiosity. They circled him, sniffed, tested. He did not flinch. He did not retreat. He simply stood among them, his eyes clear, his body still, his presence undeniable. And then one day he ran with them, fully, freely, not behind, not beside, at the front. There was no growl, no fight, no contest, because something about Buck commanded. He became their alpha. But he was not cruel, he was not ruthless. He was fierce, yes, precise, but also watchful, measured. His leadership was not built on fear, it was built on certainty. He knew who he was now, and the wild responded. They roamed vast territories, valleys, peaks, rivers frozen into glass. They hunted elk, moose, even bear when they had to. They howled to the moon, not out of loneliness, but as a declaration. We are here. We are whole. We are wild. And Buck, in that pack, was more than a member. He was the echo of something ancient, a bridge between what had been and what could be. I heard the stories. We all did. Loggers, trappers, traders. All spoke in hushed tones of a great ghost dog who led a phantom pack through the high country, stronger than any wolf, smarter than any trap, uncatchable, untouchable. Sometimes they'd find tracks in the snow larger than wolf prints, straighter, more deliberate. Sometimes they'd find carcasses untouched, as though the beast had hunted not for food, but for balance. And always, always, they spoke of the eyes. Amber, burning, human almost. They knew they were being watched, judged, and then spared. Buck, I believe, did not kill for pleasure. He killed only when the world demanded it. His justice was not human, but it was true. Still, there were nights, rare, quiet nights, when a lone howl would rise above the treetops, not with rage, not with hunger, but with grief. A call not for the pack, but for the one who was gone. John Thornton. Even in the deepest part of the forest, even in full dominion, Buck did not forget. And how could he? Thornton had loved him as no man ever had, without ownership, without conditions. He had been a shelter, a friend, a final tether to a world now lost. But memory is not a leash, it is a compass. And Buck carried it in his chest. Each year, they say, when the snow begins to melt and the rivers run fast again, he returns, alone, to the place where Thornton died, where the ashes were buried. He stands among the pines, unmoving, for hours, maybe days, and then, without sound, he turns and vanishes, back into the trees, back into the truth, back into himself. Still, I wonder, if we lose everything that shaped us, do we vanish too? Or do we become something we were always meant to be? Buck had been stripped of every bond, every role, every name, and in that emptiness he found not despair but origin. Time passes differently for stories than it does for men. For me, the days stack dry and brittle like old papers in a drawer. But for Buck, his time has become something else. Not a calendar of years, but a current in the river, a whisper in the wind, a mark in the snow. He is no longer just a memory. He is a legend. The men who came back from the north spoke of him as they would a spirit, not always with fear, but never lightly. Around fires, under stars, when the whiskey burned warm in their chests, they'd speak of the great wolf dog with the human eyes who watched from ridgelines. They said he was always near, though no one could touch him. That traps froze shut when he passed, that rifles jammed, that the forest moved to protect him. Even the wolves' creatures of instinct and tooth had changed since he came. They were smarter, faster, more coordinated, as if his presence had raised the whole pack to something greater, not just wilder, but wiser. And yet, he was not cruel. He did not attack camps unless provoked. He did not howl for conquest. He did not tear through settlements like a monster. His power was quiet like snow falling in the dark. But everyone who had seen him, even once, remembered. Because Buck was not like the others. He was a reminder that deep inside every creature, man or beast, there is something untamed. Something that does not bow to comfort or coin or collar. Something that remembers the river, the wind, the blood. And in Buck, that memory had taken form. Some called him the ghost dog, some the spirit of the north. Others simply said, he's out there. And I listened. Year after year, sitting beneath the same lemon tree in Judge Miller's garden, pruning its branches while the grandchildren played nearby, I listened. Sometimes at dusk, when the wind came from the west and the clouds hung low, I thought I heard something. A howl, low, distant, mournful. Not a cry for help, not a warning, but a call, ancient and eternal. And I would stop what I was doing, stand very still, close my eyes, and for just a moment I could see him not as he was the night I led him away, but as he had become, majestic, silent, free, running through the trees with eyes like fire and muscles like shadow, not chasing prey, not fleeing danger, just being. And it struck me then something I never understood before. I had tried to sell him, but the truth was, he had never belonged to anyone, not to the judge, not to me, not even to John Thornton. Buck belonged to the wild, and the wild had simply called him home. Still, I wonder, do we ever truly own anything, or do we simply hold it for a while until it remembers where it came from? I held Buck's trust once, briefly, and I broke it, but the wild never did. And in that, I find both my shame and my peace. There are mornings when I forget his name. Not Buck, exactly that part I'll always remember, but the sound of it in my own voice, the way I used to call to him across the garden, the rhythm of it in the air, firm, affectionate, trusted. That sound is fading now. What remains isn't the name, but the feeling, the weight of his gaze, the silence that fell when he stood still. The air seemed to shift around him, even as a young dog. That never left him. It only grew. Some dogs bark for attention. Buck never needed to. He had a presence back then, when he lay under the shade of the wisteria, and later, when his paws carved paths through the snow. It's strange, isn't it, that a dog not a dog anymore, not really, could make a man feel so small, and not with violence or vengeance, with being, because Buck never needed words, but I do, and that's what haunts me. I have told this story 1,000 times in fragments, in murmurs, never fully aloud, and always with the hope that in speaking it I might find redemption, or at least understanding. But the more I speak, the more I realize Buck did not need forgiveness. I needed to ask it anyway, for the night I sold him, for the leash, for the lie I told myself that I had no other choice. But choices, I've learned, are rarely clean. They are made in shadows, under pressure, through fear, and they shape more than we can ever know. Buck's path was forged in suffering, but it led him to truth. Mine was forged in weakness, and it led me to silence. The other workers they've long forgotten. The judge passed away some years ago. His children have grown, moved to cities, started new lives. I still tend the garden. It is smaller now, wilder. I let the vines grow longer than I should. Sometimes I imagine Buck here again, stepping through the tall grass, sniffing the air like a memory. But I know that version of him, the one who belonged here, is gone, not dead, just transformed. They say wolves fear him now, that the pack he leads doesn't howl unless he does, that he walks the line between beast and legend. But I wonder if he still dreams, and if, in those dreams, he remembers the warmth of a kitchen, the laughter of children, the weight of a hand on his back, not with longing, but with a kind of distant gratitude, because Buck did not reject love. He simply followed something older, the truth of what he was, and perhaps that's the difference between us. He returned to what was real. I remained, surrounded by walls and names and tasks, trying to forget what I had done. Still, I wonder, Is survival the same as freedom? Or does freedom require something more, something wild and true and beyond regret? Buck had become more than survivor, more than pet, more than wolf. He had become elemental. And Ions, the man who led him down a path of pain, could only watch from afar, from the safety of fences and fences and fences. The seasons have lost their urgency for me. Spring used to mean new plantings. Autumn meant harvest. But now they simply pass like pages turned by someone who stopped reading the story. But in the north, I imagine, the seasons are still sacred. They arrive not with a whisper, but with a reckoning. Snow doesn't fall, it claims. Rivers don't freeze, they seize. And yet life goes on, especially for creatures like Buck, because Buck did not fear the seasons. He moved with them. When the rivers thawed, he followed the scent of fish. When the elk herds migrated, he moved with the wind. When winter returned, he did not hide. He howled, not in mourning, in recognition. He had become a creature of rhythm of cycles and instinct and knowing without needing to ask. His body, his breath, his bones, all tuned to the ancient tempo of the land. They say his pack grew, that wolves from distant regions came to run beside him, not through conquest, but invitation. There was something in him, not dominance, but gravity. He didn't force others to follow. He simply moved, and they moved with him. And in this movement, a new law emerged. Not man's law, not the law of club or whip, but the law of balance. Prey was hunted only when needed. Territory was not seized, but respected. The pack, under Buck, was not a gang of killers, it was a family of survivors. And in that wild, brutal place, survival was sacred. I heard a story once from a trader passing through California, weathered and quiet, the kind who'd seen things and no longer cared to impress anyone. He said he'd glimpsed Buck. At a distance through a sheet of falling snow, a massive shape moving along a ridge, wolves flanking him, his head high, his stride clean. There was blood on the wind, and yet the beast was calm, regal. The trader said, "It wasn't a dog I saw. It wasn't even a wolf. It was what we all used to be, long before names." And I believed him, because Buck had become more than flesh. He had become a reminder of what is unwritten, of what we bury when we build fences, of what we forget when we trade the stars for ceilings and the wind for walls. Even now, as I sit on this old bench beneath a lemon tree gone crooked with time, I feel him. Not as guilt, not even as memory, but as presence. He is out there, not because I sold him, but because he answered something no man could silence. And in doing so, he became not just a creature of the wild, but a part of it. Still, I wonder, if we lose everything that was placed upon us, our names, our homes, our fears, what remains? Is it emptiness, or is it truth? Buck shed everything we gave him, the leash, the house, even the name we called. And what remained was not less. It was more. The older I grow, the more I believe that stories live longer than the people who tell them. And Buck's story, it outlived us all. Long after the trail faded, long after the gold rush died into dust, long after the names of men were forgotten or folded into history, his story remained, passed from mouth to mouth, shaped by fireside shadows and frost-bitten tongues. Hunters spoke of him, so did poets. Children who had never seen snow still whispered about the wolf dog who walked between two worlds. And in every version, there was a tension. Was he a ghost? A guardian? A punishment? A promise? No one agreed, but they all believed. He had become myth, not because he disappeared, but because he endured. I think that's what the wild does. It doesn't preserve things in amber. It wears them down to essence. And Buck's essence was truth. When I was younger, I used to think truth was something you told. Something you spoke into a room and then it either landed or it didn't. Now I know better. Truth isn't something we say. It's something we live or we don't. And Buck, he lived it fully, fiercely, without apology, without fear. He didn't return to Santa Clara. Of course not. That gate never opened again for him. But I still find paw prints in my dreams, not just in the garden, but in places I've never been. Mountain passes, frozen lakes, dense forests where sunlight never fully lands. He's always running in those dreams, not from anything, not toward anything, just running, because he can, because he must. And I am always watching, from afar, from the past. I sometimes wonder what would have happened had I not sold him, if I had turned away from the deal, gone back inside, pretended I never had the thought. Would Buck have lived a long life in comfort? Would he have died in a soft bed, old and slow? Maybe, but he would never have known the cold bite of the Yukon wind. He would never have run beside wolves, or howled beneath the aurora, or looked a grizzly in the eye and stood his ground. He would never have remembered who he truly was. And that makes my guilt strange. I was the one who betrayed him, and yet I was also the one who unleashed him, not by courage, not by love, by failure. Isn't it strange how sometimes the worst thing we do leads to the most beautiful unfolding? I did not intend to set him free. I meant to cage him elsewhere. But fate is not so easily directed. And Buck Hay did not submit to my sin. He transcended it. Still, I wonder, if we cannot undo our mistakes, can we at least be faithful witnesses to what they became? That is all I can be now. Not a redeemer, not a hero, just a man who saw something magnificent take shape from the ruins of a terrible choice. And maybe, just maybe, that is enough. They say the forest keeps its secrets, but I think the forest shares them with those who know how to listen. There's an old trapper who comes through town every few winters. His beard is white now. His eyes are faded like paper left in the sun. But when he speaks of the high country, his voice sharpens. You can hear the frost in it. He told me once without looking up from his tea. The great one's still out there. He's slower now, maybe, greyer, but the forest still bends when he passes. I didn't ask who he meant. I didn't need to. I knew. Buck, even now, after all these years, after generations of dogs have lived and died, after men have paved roads where sleds once slid, his presence still lingers. They say you can hear him on winter nights. Not every night, not like a ghost. But sometimes, when the wind is right and the world falls quiet, there comes a howl, low, layered, long, like the bones of the earth remembering something they're not supposed to forget. Not rage, not grief, just existence. Proof that something true is still out there. It comforts me, oddly, because I know I will never see him again. Not truly, not with these old eyes, but I don't need to. Buck has become part of the land itself, part of the way rivers sound when they thaw, part of the way snow sinks beneath a silent paw, part of the hush before a hunt begins. He is no longer just a creature. He is a pattern, a rhythm, a memory that nature keeps breathing. And me? I'm just an old man with dirt under his nails, trying to keep a garden alive in a town that grows quieter every year. The judge's grandchildren have moved away. The lemon tree doesn't fruit like it used to. The soil is harder now. Or maybe I'm just softer. But sometimes when I sit alone at dusk, I close my eyes. And I see him. Not the way he was, not the pampered pet, not even the sled leader. I see him as he must be now, standing tall on a snowy ridge, his coat glinting under a northern moon, his breath like smoke rising into the stars. The pack surrounds him. He doesn't look back, because there's nothing to look back to. He has returned, fully. Returned not to a place, but to a state of being. A state no human can quite understand, but we can glimpse it sometimes, in silence, in wind, in the wildness we keep buried. Still, I wonder, what part of me stayed with him? And what part of him still walks the edges of my dreams? Perhaps we don't truly lose what we love. Perhaps it simply becomes unreachable like a mountain you can't climb anymore, but still honor every time you look toward the horizon. Buck is free. And because of that, perhaps, so am I. The garden is quiet now. Even the birds seem to know. They perch without singing, wings tucked, heads tilted, as if listening not for a sound, but for a memory. I sit beneath the old lemon tree, its branches crooked, its fruit fewer each year. My hands rest in my lap, spotted, veined, no longer strong, but they remember. Oh, they remember. They remember the feel of the rope, the soft fur beneath it, the weight of a choice that could never be unmade. But this is not a story about guilt, not anymore. It's a story about returning. Because somewhere, far beyond the reach of roads and voices, Buck is still running. Maybe slower now, maybe not as often, but running still, through snowfall and pine, beside rivers that know his name. He does not wear a collar. He does not answer to a whistle. He answers only to the call. And I, who once stole his freedom for a handful of coins, have spent a lifetime learning what he already knew. That freedom isn't escape. It's alignment with who you are and where you are meant to be. And Buck, he is exactly where he was meant to be. The forest has shaped him. The wild has named him. And time has remembered him not as a pet, but as a force. A legend whispered across ridgelines, a glint of gold in the snow, a howl that doesn't fade. I won't be here much longer. That's no tragedy. It's just the closing of a long, uneven chapter. But I find comfort in knowing that while my voice may quiet, his will not. Some nights when I wake before dawn and the world is still, I imagine I can hear it, a single distant howl rising above the hills like incense, and I smile. Not because I've been forgiven, but because he has become. What I once broke, the wild rebuilt, stronger, purer, whole. Still, I wonder, when we are gone, will anything of us remain in the creatures we once knew? Or does the love we failed to give still echo long after we are forgotten? I cannot answer that, but I can close my eyes, breathe the cool morning air, and see him, a shape against the sky, a silhouette made of silence and fire, turning once, then gone, and that is enough. Goodbye, Buck. Run far, run true. And if ever the stars guide your feet back to where this began, know there is one nonce foolish, now quiet, who never stopped listening for your name, even when he could no longer speak it.